The crisp morning air nipped at John Wilson's face as he sat on the edge of his bed, taking slow, deliberate breaths. His alarm had gone off at 7 a.m., just like every other day, but mornings were never easy. The sunlight streaming through his bedroom window caught the medals displayed on his dresser, reminders of his service in Afghanistan that felt like a lifetime ago. John reached down to massage his residual limb, something that had become part of his morning routine since losing his right leg during his final deployment. The phantom pains were particularly bothersome today, dancing like electric shocks up a leg that wasn't there anymore. But John had learned to work through the discomfort. He'd faced worse challenges in his 45 years of life. Next to his bed, his service dog Max lifted his head, his warm brown eyes watching intently as John began his morning routine. Max was more than just a service animal. He'd become John's closest companion over the past 3 years. The golden retriever's tail thumped gently against the floor as John scratched behind his ears. "Ready for another day, buddy?" John asked, reaching for his prosthetic leg. The familiar process of attaching it had become second nature, though he never quite got used to the cold touch of metal against his skin. Max stood up, already anticipating the routine, his training vest laid out nearby. As John made his way to the bathroom, he couldn't help but smile at the photos lining his hallway. There he was, standing proud in his military uniform, surrounded by his fellow soldiers. Another showed him teaching his nephew how to fish last summer, prosthetic leg visible but not defining the moment. These glimpses of his life, both before and after his injury, reminded him of how far he'd come. The morning routine took longer than it used to, but John had learned to be patient with himself. He showered carefully, balancing with the stability bars he'd installed himself. The act of getting dressed, once taken for granted, now required careful planning and movements. But John approached each task with the same determination that had gotten him through rehabilitation. In his small but tidy kitchen, John prepared a simple breakfast while Max waited patiently by his food bowl. The morning news played quietly in the background as he made his coffee and toast. He needed to go grocery shopping today. The list on his fridge was growing longer, and his cupboards were getting bare. Reading through his shopping list one more time, John felt a flutter of anxiety in his stomach. Shopping wasn't as simple as it used to be. The crowded aisles, the reaching for items, the occasional stares, they all added up to make what should be a simple task more challenging. But he refused to let his disability define his independence. "Looking good, Max," John said as he attached the service dog's vest. Max sat perfectly still, years of training evident in his calm demeanor. The dog's presence always made public outings easier, acting as both a physical support and a reassuring companion. Checking his wallet and phone, John took one final look in the mirror by his front door. The face that looked back at him was weathered but determined. His gray-speckled hair was neatly combed, his plaid shirt pressed, his military habits of staying well-groomed hadn't faded with time. As he locked his front door, John's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, waved from her porch where she was watering her plants. She was one of the few people who treated him exactly the same as before his injury, often bringing over home-cooked meals and chatting about her grandchildren. "Good morning, John," she called out. "Don't forget it might rain later." John waved back, grateful for her kindness. "Thanks for the heads up. I'll bring an umbrella." The walk to his adapted car was short, but each step was measured and purposeful. Max stayed close to his left side, matching his pace perfectly. The morning sun had warmed the air, and the sounds of the neighborhood coming to life. Birds chirping, kids waiting for the school bus, cars starting, created a familiar symphony. As John settled into the driver's seat and helped Max into the back, he took a deep breath. Today was just another day, another small battle in his ongoing journey. He didn't know that this ordinary shopping trip would turn into something quite extraordinary, or that his quiet dignity would soon be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. "All right, Max," he said, adjusting his mirrors and starting the engine. "Let's see what kind of adventure today brings us." The car pulled away from the curb, joining the morning traffic as John mentally prepared himself for the day ahead. Little did he know, this ordinary Tuesday would become a day that would change not just his life, but the lives of several others in ways none of them could have predicted. The parking lot of Martin's grocery store was half full when John pulled in, carefully choosing a spot near the entrance. He'd learned from experience that the extra-wide disabled parking spaces made it much easier to help Max out of the car and get himself situated with minimum fuss. As he switched off the engine, John noticed a young mom struggling with her toddler in the spot next to him. The little boy was having what looked like a mighty tantrum, his face red as he refused to get into his car seat. The mom caught John's eye and gave him an embarrassed smile. John smiled back warmly, remembering his sister dealing with similar situations with his nephew years ago. "Some days are just harder than others, aren't they?" he said kindly as he opened his car door. The mom's shoulders relaxed a bit, grateful for the understanding. Her little boy stopped mid-scream, suddenly fascinated by Max, who was now carefully stepping out of the back seat. "Is that a real dog?" the toddler asked, tears forgotten. His mother seized the moment to buckle him into his car seat while he was distracted. "This is Max," John replied, maintaining his balance as he reached for his shopping bags. "He's my helper dog." The boy's eyes went wide with wonder, and his mother mouthed a silent thank you to John as she finished securing her son. Inside the store, the cool air conditioning hit John's face as he grabbed a shopping cart. Max stayed close, his training evident in the way he navigated the busy entrance without getting distracted by the various smells and sounds of the grocery store. The morning crowd was starting to build. Elderly couples with their carefully planned lists, hurried professionals grabbing quick lunches, and stay-at-home parents doing their weekly shopping. John pulled out his list and began methodically working his way through the aisles. He'd learned to organize his shopping by store layout, making the trip as efficient as possible. The produce section came first, and he carefully selected some apples and oranges, checking each one before placing it in his cart. A store employee stocking lettuce gave him a friendly nod. She'd helped him reach high shelves before and always had a kind word to share. In the bread aisle, John encountered his first challenge of the day. The whole wheat loaves he preferred had been moved to the top shelf, just out of comfortable reach. He looked around, hoping to spot a helpful employee, but the nearest staff member was busy helping another customer. Taking a deep breath, John steadied himself against his cart and reached up, his prosthetic leg making the stretch more difficult than it would have been years ago. An elderly gentleman shopping nearby noticed his struggle and stepped forward. "Let me get that for you, son," he offered, his own movements slow but purposeful. John noticed the Korean War veteran's cap the man wore and felt a moment of connection. "Much appreciated, sir," John said, accepting both the bread and the man's understanding nod. No other words were needed. There was a silent recognition between them, an understanding that came from shared experiences despite their different eras of service. As John moved through the store, his cart gradually filled with necessities. He'd gotten pretty good at maneuvering through the aisles, though sometimes the tight corners required extra concentration. Max stayed vigilant, helping John maintain his balance when needed and providing a reassuring presence when the store's crowded spaces became overwhelming. Near the cereal aisle, a small group of middle school kids on their lunch break came barreling around the corner, their excited chatter filling the space. They stopped short when they saw Max, their eyes moving from the service dog to John's prosthetic leg visible below his shorts. John was used to curious looks, especially from children, but these kids surprised him with their politeness. "Sorry, sir," one of them said, nudging his friends to move their cart aside. "Your dog is really cool." The sincerity in the boy's voice made John smile. He remembered being their age, how everything seemed possible then, before life had thrown its curveballs. "Thanks, guys. His name is Max, and he's very good at his job." The kids grinned, carefully walking past while giving Max the space he needed to work. It was moments like these that helped balance out the harder days. As John approached the canned goods section, he noticed the narrow passage created by a large display of soup cans stacked in a pyramid. It was an impressive structure, but it left little room for his cart to pass safely. He could already feel the eyes of other shoppers on him as he carefully tried to navigate the tight space. What happened next would turn this ordinary shopping trip into something quite different. As John attempted to squeeze past the display, his cart caught on an uneven floor tile. The slight jolt was enough to throw off his balance, and as he reached out to steady himself, his arm brushed against the carefully stacked pyramid of cans. The first can wobbled, then another, and John watched with a sinking feeling as the situation began to unfold. He knew what was coming, But with Max on one side and his cart on the other, there wasn't much he could do to prevent it. The sound of the first can hitting the floor seemed to echo through the store, drawing attention from every direction. Little did John know that what was about to happen next would test not just his patience, but the character of everyone around him. As he stood there, surrounded by rolling cans and curious onlookers, he had no idea that this moment would become a turning point in his story, one that would reveal both the worst and the best in people. The sound of cans hitting the floor seemed to go on forever. Each metallic clang drew more attention until it felt like everyone in the store was watching. John stood completely still, his hand gripping his cart tightly as the last can rolled to a stop somewhere under the shelves. Max pressed closer to his leg, sensing his handler's distress, but maintaining his trained composure. For a moment, there was complete silence in the aisle. Then came the quick, sharp footsteps that John knew meant trouble. He'd heard that particular walk before, the sound of authority approaching with judgment already made. The store manager appeared around the corner, his face already twisted into a frown that deepened when he saw the scattered cans and the service dog. "What's going on here?" the manager demanded, his voice carrying that special kind of loudness designed to make others feel small. His name tag read Robert, but there was nothing friendly about his demeanor. He surveyed the scene with his hands on his hips, his eyes moving from the fallen display to John's prosthetic leg with barely concealed disdain. "I apologize," John began, his voice steady despite his embarrassment. "The aisle was a bit tight, and I lost my balance." "Do you have any idea how long it took to build that display?" Robert cut him off, his voice rising. "We can't have people just coming in here and destroying our merchandise." A small crowd had begun to gather at both ends of the aisle, some pretending to shop while obviously watching the scene unfold. John took a deep breath, the same way he'd learned to do during his rehabilitation when things got tough. "Sir, I'm happy to help clean this up. It was an accident and—" "An accident? This is exactly why people with disabilities should shop during off hours." Robert's words hit like a physical blow. A collective intake of breath came from the onlookers, but nobody stepped forward. John felt his face grow hot, not from embarrassment anymore, but from a slow-building anger he fought to control. Max sensed the tension and shifted his position, placing himself more firmly against John's leg for support. The dog's presence helped ground him, reminding him of all the techniques he'd learned for handling difficult situations. But before John could respond, Robert continued his tirade. "And what's this dog doing in here? We sell food. This is a health code violation waiting to happen." Robert gestured wildly at Max, who maintained his professional composure despite the manager's aggressive movements. "He's a certified service dog," John explained, his voice tight but controlled. He'd been through this before, the law was on his side, but that didn't always make these confrontations any easier. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act. "Oh, everyone has a service dog these days," Robert scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Every time someone wants to bring their pet shopping, suddenly it's a service animal." He made air quotes with his fingers, drawing a few uncomfortable laughs from the growing audience. An elderly woman with her cart tried to squeeze past the scene, and Robert used this as fuel for his fire. "See, you're blocking the whole aisle. Other customers can't even shop properly because of this mess you've created." John felt his throat tighten. He'd faced enemy fire, endured countless surgeries, and pushed through months of rehabilitation, but somehow this public humiliation felt just as challenging. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the aisle too narrow, the watching eyes too many. "I served this country," John said quietly, more to himself than to Robert, but the manager heard him and let out a harsh laugh. "Oh, that's supposed to give you special privileges? To come in here and make a mess of my store? To disturb other customers? To bring animals in where we handle food?" Each question felt like another can hitting the floor. John could feel his hand shaking on the cart handle, not from fear, but from the effort it took to maintain his composure. He thought of all the young soldiers he'd led, how he taught them to handle adversity with dignity. He wouldn't let this man take that dignity from him now. A young store employee had appeared with a broom, hovering uncertainly at the edge of the scene. She seemed to want to help but was clearly afraid to interfere with her manager's dramatic performance. The cans lay scattered around them like casualties of this unexpected battlefield, their bright labels reflecting the overhead lights. "If you'll just let me help clean this up," John tried one more time, but Robert held up his hand in a stopping gesture that was more like a slap. "No, no, you've done quite enough damage. I think it's best if you just leave. We'll add up the cost of any dented cans and send you the bill." Robert's voice had taken on a falsely professional tone that somehow made his words even more cutting. The silence in the store had become oppressive. John could feel dozens of eyes on him, could sense the discomfort of the onlookers who knew this was wrong, but remained frozen in that very human moment of not wanting to get involved. Max pressed even closer, his warm presence a reminder that at least he wasn't completely alone in this moment of humiliation. And then, from somewhere behind the gathered crowd, came the sound of small footsteps and a young voice that would change everything about this situation. The voice was clear, innocent, and completely unafraid, the kind of voice that could only come from someone too young to have learned when to stay silent in the face of injustice. Nobody in the store, not John, not Robert, not the gathered crowd, was prepared for what happened next. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest sources, and sometimes the purest wisdom comes from those we least expect to teach us. "My grandpa has a leg just like his." The clear voice cut through the tense atmosphere like a ray of sunshine through storm clouds. The crowd parted, revealing a small girl, no more than 10 years old, standing with her hands on her hips. She wore a simple blue dress with a backpack shaped like a unicorn, and her eyes held the kind of determination that only children can muster. The store manager, Robert, turned to face this unexpected interruption, his expression flickering between annoyance and uncertainty. It's one thing to berate an adult in public, quite another to face down a child speaking her truth. "Young lady, this is none of your concern," Robert said, his voice notably softer but still carrying that edge of authority. "Where are your parents?" "I'm right here," came a woman's voice, and a mother stepped forward from the crowd. She placed her hands on her daughter's shoulders but didn't pull her back. Instead, she stood tall, letting her daughter speak. The little girl took a step forward, her sneakers lighting up with each determined step. "My grandpa lost his leg in Vietnam," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "And he says that being different doesn't make you less of a person. It makes you brave." John felt something catch in his throat. Max's tail wagged slightly, picking up on the shift in energy around them. The little girl wasn't finished. "My teacher told us that veterans fought for our country," she said, looking directly at Robert now. "She said they're heroes who gave up parts of themselves so we could be safe. And you're being mean to a hero." The simplicity of her words seemed to hang in the air. Several people in the crowd nodded, and someone in the back began to clap slowly. Robert's face had turned an interesting shade of red, but now it was from embarrassment rather than anger. "When Billy pushed me down at school," the girl continued, "the principal made him apologize and help me up. That's what grown-ups are supposed to do when they make mistakes." She pointed at the scattered cans. "You should help pick these up." Her mother squeezed her shoulders gently. "Annie, honey," she began, but stopped when an elderly man stepped forward from the crowd. "The little lady's right," he said, his voice gravelly with age. He bent down carefully and picked up one of the fallen cans. "I served in Korea, and I never thought I'd see the day when a fellow veteran would be treated this way in my own hometown." It was like a spell had been broken. People began moving forward, picking up cans, offering words of support. A teenage boy who had been stocking shelves nearby brought over a basket to collect the cans. 2 women who had been watching from the dairy aisle came forward with their own words of support. "My brother came back from Iraq last year," one of them said, looking Robert straight in the eye. "He struggles every day with things most people take for granted. Shame on you." Robert stood frozen, watching as his audience transformed from silent observers into active participants in setting things right. The little girl walked over to Max, looking up at John with a smile. "Can I pet your dog?" she asked, showing more manners than the store manager had in the entire confrontation. "Not right now, sweetheart," John replied gently. "He's working. But thank you for your kind words. Your grandpa must be very proud of you." Her face lit up at that, and she beamed at her mother, who was now helping to reorganize the display with several other customers. The scene had transformed from one of humiliation to one of community, all because a child had been brave enough to speak up. I apologize," Robert finally managed to say, though the words seemed to cause him physical pain. I was out of line. His apology might have sounded forced, but the shame in his eyes was real. "Perhaps," said the little girl's mother, straightening up from where she'd been collecting cans, "this would be a good opportunity to review the store's training policies regarding customers with disabilities." Her tone was pleasant but firm, the kind that suggested this wasn't just a suggestion. Other customers began sharing their own stories, of family members with disabilities, of friends who had served, of their own struggles with prejudice and misunderstanding. The aisle had become a place of connection rather than conflict, all because one small voice had dared to speak up. John watched it all with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. Max stood steady beside him, as always, but now they were surrounded by support instead of judgment. The little girl had moved on to helping arrange the cans in their new display, chattering happily about how her grandpa could tell amazing stories about his time in the service. An older woman touched John's arm gently. "My late husband was a Marine," she said softly. "He always said that the true measure of a society is how it treats those who sacrificed for it. That little girl gives me hope for the future." The store's atmosphere had completely changed. What had started as a moment of public humiliation had transformed into something entirely different, a reminder that sometimes it takes a child's pure heart to teach adults about humanity, dignity, and respect. And through it all, the scattered cans were being collected, one by one, not by the person who had knocked them down, but by a community that had finally remembered what it meant to stand together. The simple wisdom of a child had turned a moment of cruelty into an opportunity for connection, proving that sometimes the smallest voices can make the biggest difference. The next few minutes in the store felt like watching a community wake up from a long sleep. Robert, the store manager, stood awkwardly to the side as more people stepped forward to help and share their stories. His earlier anger had deflated completely, replaced by visible discomfort as he witnessed the impact of his actions. A young store employee appeared with a chair from the break room, offering it to John. "You might want to rest a minute, sir," she said quietly. "I'm so sorry about what happened. My dad's a veteran too." John accepted the chair gratefully, the stress of the confrontation having taken its toll on his leg. The little girl, still busy helping organize cans with the other customers, kept glancing over at Max with undisguised interest. Her mother walked over to John, carrying a bottle of water she'd grabbed from her shopping cart. "I'm Beth," she said, offering the water. "And that little force of nature over there is my daughter Annie. I'd say I'm sorry for her interrupting, but," she smiled warmly. John took a sip of water, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. "No need to apologize. Your daughter, she reminded me of why I served in the first place, to protect that kind of pure-hearted bravery." More customers had gathered, but now, instead of silent observers, they were active participants in a spontaneous community gathering. An elderly couple shared stories about their son who served in the Navy. A college student mentioned his brother who was currently deployed overseas. Each story wove together, creating a tapestry of shared experiences and understanding. Robert had disappeared briefly into his office, and when he returned, his face had a different kind of redness, the kind that comes from a stern phone call with district management. He approached John again, this time with none of his previous arrogance. "Sir," he began, his voice heavy with embarrassment, "I've just spoken with my superior. I want to formally apologize for my completely unacceptable behavior. The company has a strict policy about service animals and accessibility, which I violated. More importantly, I forgot my basic human decency." The store had grown quieter as people listened to his apology. Annie had stopped arranging cans to watch, her small hands on her hips again, like a tiny supervisor making sure things were being done right. "We'll be implementing immediate training for all staff about proper interaction with customers with disabilities," Robert continued. And he swallowed hard. "I'll be taking some time off to do community service at the local veteran center, if they'll have me." John looked at the manager thoughtfully. He'd seen this before, people caught in their worst moments, facing a choice about how to move forward. During his rehabilitation, he'd learned that sometimes the hardest battles weren't physical at all, but were about finding grace in difficult moments. "We all have bad days," John said finally. "What matters is what we learn from them." He extended his hand to Robert, who took it with visible relief. Annie bounced over, her task with the cans completed. "Does this mean you're not going to be me anymore?" she asked Robert directly, causing several people to hide their smiles. "Annie," her mother warned gently, but Robert shook his head. "No, she's right to ask," he said. "No, young lady, I'm going to work very hard to never act that way again. Thank you for teaching me an important lesson today." The store's atmosphere had completely transformed. What had started as a scene of conflict had become something like a community gathering. An elderly woman was showing pictures of her veteran husband to a young mother. Two teenagers who had been recording the incident on their phones were now helping to reorganize the display properly. The rest of the shopping trip turned into something John could never have expected. With Annie skipping along beside the cart and her mother Beth following with her own shopping, the simple task of grocery shopping became almost like a small parade through the store. Max walked proudly beside them, occasionally glancing up at Annie as if checking on their new friend. "So your dog helps you balance?" Annie asked as they turned down the cereal aisle. She was full of questions, but asked them with a respect that many adults could learn from. "That's right," John explained, reaching for a box of cereal. "Max is trained to help me when my prosthetic leg makes things tricky. He's like having an extra pair of eyes and a strong shoulder to lean on when I need it. Like a real-life superhero sidekick." Annie's eyes sparkled with excitement. Beth smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. "Annie's been learning about service animals in school," she explained. "They had a presentation last month about different types of assistance dogs." Other customers who had witnessed the earlier incident nodded respectfully as they passed. The store had a different feeling now, warmer, more connected. The teenage employee who had brought the chair earlier was now making sure the aisles were extra wide and clear as they approached. "Mr. John," Annie said thoughtfully as they reached the dairy section, "can I tell you something about my grandpa?" She waited for his nod before continuing. "Sometimes he gets sad about his leg, but then he tells me that his scars are like medals. They show that he was brave enough to fight for something important." John felt his throat tighten with emotion. Out of the mouths of babes, as they say. "Your grandpa sounds like a very wise man," he managed to say. "He is," Annie beamed. "He says that the hardest part wasn't losing his leg, it was learning to ask for help when he needed it. But then he says that letting people help you is like giving them a gift, because it makes them feel good too." Beth wiped a quiet tear from her corner of her eye. "Dad's been teaching her a lot about empathy and courage," she explained. "Though I think she came by both naturally." As they moved through the store, more people began to share their own stories. A young man stocking shelves mentioned his sister who worked with service dogs. An elderly woman talked about her grandson who had just enlisted. The grocery store had transformed into a place of connection and understanding. Robert, the store manager, approached them again near the checkout area. He looked different now, humbled, but also somehow more human. "I've been making some calls," he said. "We're going to be hosting a Veterans Appreciation Day every month with special assistance available for shopping. And," he paused, looking directly at Annie, "we're going to start a program where local school children can learn about service animals and disability awareness." Annie's face lit up. "Can my class come? We're learning about community helpers." "That's actually a wonderful idea," Beth said. "It would tie in perfectly with their current curriculum." John watched as Robert took notes on his phone, the same device he had earlier used to call his superiors now being used to plan community outreach. It was amazing how quickly things could change when people opened their hearts to understanding. Near the checkout, they encountered the elderly veteran who had been one of the first to help pick up the cans. He was just finishing his own shopping and stopped to chat. "You know," he said, looking at Annie, "in all my years, I've never seen anyone handle a situation quite like you did, young lady. You reminded an old soldier what courage really looks like." Annie blushed and held onto her mother's hand. "I just said what my heart told me to say," she replied simply. As the cashier began scanning John's items, more customers gathered around, not to stare this time, but to be part of something special that was happening. The store's regular background music seemed to fade away, replaced by the warm buzz of conversation and connection. One of the other cashiers opened a new lane and called out, "I can help any veterans or customers with disabilities over here." She had taken it upon herself to create a more accessible checkout option, something that hadn't existed in the store just hours before. "See what you started." John said to Annie as they finished checking out. Sometimes it just takes one person being brave enough to speak up, and then everything can change. Max sat patiently as they loaded the groceries into bags, his tray perfect as always, but there was a contentment in his posture that seemed to reflect the mood of everyone around them. Even he seemed to understand that something important had happened here today. As they headed toward the exit, Robert called out one last time, "Sir, we'll be making some changes to our store layout too, wider aisles, better access. Would you be willing to come back and give us feedback once we start the renovations?" John turned back, surprised but pleased. "I'd be honored," he replied. "And maybe Annie here can be part of the consulting team. She seems to have a good eye for what's right." The automatic doors opened to the afternoon sunlight, and as they stepped out into the parking lot, it felt like they were leaving a different store than the one they had entered. What had started as a simple shopping trip had become something much more. A reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest voices, and that courage comes in many forms. The parking lot was bathed in warm afternoon sunlight as John, Beth, and Annie walked to their cars together. Other customers who had witnessed the day's events waved goodbye, some stopping to help load groceries or share a final word of support. The whole scene felt worlds away from the tension-filled moment that had started it all just a couple of hours ago. "Mom, can we give Mr. John and Max our phone number?" Annie asked, bouncing on her toes as they reached their cars. Maybe he could come meet Grandpa someday. They could talk about important stuff. Beth smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. "That's up to Mr. John, honey. Remember what we said about respecting people's privacy." John found himself chuckling as he loaded his groceries into his trunk, Max sitting patiently by his side. "Actually, I'd like that very much. Your grandpa sounds like someone I'd enjoy meeting." As they exchanged contact information, more ripples of the day's events continued to spread through the parking lot. The teenage employee who had brought John the chair earlier was now helping an elderly woman with her groceries, something that might not have happened on a normal day. The store manager, Robert, could be seen through the front windows, taking down notes as he walked the aisles, already planning the promised renovations. "You know," Beth said thoughtfully as she helped Annie into their car, "I've been shopping here for years, but this is the first time it's felt like a real community." She paused, then added, "Annie's father passed away when she was very young. My dad, her grandpa, has been such an important part of her life, teaching her about strength and kindness. Today, I saw all of his lessons shine through in her." John nodded, understanding the depth of what she was saying. "Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who have faced the biggest challenges," he replied. "Your daughter reminded everyone in that store today about the power of speaking up for what's right." Annie rolled down her car window. "Mr. John, can I tell you one more thing my grandpa always says?" At his encouraging nod, she continued, "He says that when you lose something, like he lost his leg, you gain something too, like a new way of seeing the world and understanding other people better." The wisdom in her words, passed down from her grandfather and delivered with a child's pure sincerity, struck John deeply. Max wagged his tail gently, as if agreeing with Annie's words. "Your grandpa is absolutely right," John said. "And you know what? Today you helped an entire store full of people gain something new, a better understanding of each other." A gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the parking lot, carrying with it the promise of change. Inside the store, Robert could be seen shaking hands with the elderly veteran who had helped earlier, their previous tension replaced by what looked like the beginning of understanding. "Mr. John?" Annie called out one last time as Beth started their car. "Promise you'll come back to the store. Maybe next time you can tell me some of your stories too." "I promise," John replied, touched by her genuine interest. "And next time, I'll tell you about some of the brave people I've met, though none quite as brave as a little girl who stood up to a grown-up when she knew he was wrong." As Beth's car pulled away, Annie waving enthusiastically from the window, John took a moment to reflect on the day's events. What had started as a humiliating incident had transformed into something beautiful. A reminder that courage comes in all sizes and that sometimes the strongest voices are the smallest ones. He looked down at Max, who had stayed steadfast through it all. "Well, buddy, I think we did more than just grocery shopping today." Max looked up at him with those understanding eyes that had seen him through so many challenges. Opening his car door, John noticed a piece of paper tucked under his windshield wiper. It was a hand-drawn card, clearly made by Annie while her mother was loading their groceries. On it was a simple drawing of a stick figure with a dog, and written in a child's careful handwriting were the words, "Heroes come in all kinds. Thank you for being you." As John drove home, the grocery bags secure in his trunk and Max watching the world go by from the backseat, he thought about how one small moment of adversity had opened the door for so much positive change. The store would never be quite the same, and neither would anyone who had witnessed what happened there today. Back at the store, unknown to John, Robert was already on the phone with his district manager, not just reporting the incident but proposing new training programs and accessibility initiatives. The elderly veteran had offered to help conduct sensitivity training, sharing his own experiences to help staff better understand the challenges faced by disabled customers. And somewhere in town, a little girl was telling her grandfather about how she'd met another brave veteran today, and how standing up for what's right sometimes means being the first voice willing to speak. Her simple act of courage would continue to ripple outward, touching lives in ways she might never know, proving that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest hearts. The sun was setting as John pulled into his driveway, casting long shadows across his front yard. Mrs. Chen was still tending to her garden next door, and she waved as he got out of his car. He had quite a story to tell her over their next cup of tea. A story about how a child's wisdom had turned a moment of darkness into a light that would shine for many days to come.